the Declaration on the Right and Responsibility of Individuals, Groups, and Organs of Society to promote and protect universally recognized human rights and fundamental freedoms. Black Laws, Edition 9. Individual. Existing as an indivisible entity. Of or relating to a single person or thing as opposed to a group. Black Laws, 5th edition. Individual. As a noun, this term denotes a single person, as distinguished from a group or class, meaning class of persons, and also, very commonly, a private or natural person, as distinguished from a partnership, cooperation, stressing that the prime responsibility and duty to promote and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms lie with the state. Recognizing the right and the responsibility of individuals, groups, and associations to promote respect for and foster knowledge of human rights and fundamental freedoms at the national and international levels. Article 1. Everyone has the right, individually and in association with others, to promote and to strive for the protection and realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms at the national and international levels. Article 2. Each state has a prime, there's that word again, prime, responsibility and duty to protect, promote, and implement all human rights and fundamental freedoms by adopting such steps as may be necessary to create all conditions necessary in the social, economic, political, and other fields, as well as the legal guarantees required to ensure, now listen, that all persons under its jurisdiction, individually and in association with others, are able to enjoy all those rights and freedoms in practice. Black Laws, Edition 2. Prime. To stand first or paramount. To take precedence or priority of. In the international instrument, the International Covenant, called the Declaration on the Rights and Responsibilities of Individuals and Groups for the Promotion and the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. This is a booklet of law, an article of law, that Canada is under obligation to respect, that actually everyone is under obligation to respect. Now, it says that we have an obligation as human beings, as men and women, to protect. Notice that word, protect. That calls on duty. When you're acting in a capacity of protecting something, you're operating from a capacity of having a duty. So, protect and promote human rights and fundamental freedoms. So it's your duty as a man or woman to protect and promote fundamental rights and freedoms for all of us. And when you don't, when you just let them walk all over you and strip you of your fundamental rights and freedoms by classifying you as a legal person and making you pay for rights and benefits, then you're not doing your duty as a human being to promote and protect the rights and freedoms. And the more of us that don't do our duty, the more they're just going to continue to strip away our fundamental rights and freedoms until we are completely rendered slaves. I already believe to the majority of an extent we are already rendered slaves, worse than what you would find in biblical times. But nevertheless, if we don't do our duty as human beings to hold those in the state responsible for the promotion and protection of our human rights and freedoms, they're going to take them all away. And Canada will be a bad place. Anyways, it states that in this declaration that it is the state's prime responsibility prime responsibility. Now, prime means the first and foremost, should be the most important fact. It is the prime responsibility of the state. It's a duty to promote and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms. So there is a legal obligation, a legal liability that lies upon, or that the state is under, Canada is under, and it's a prime obligation, it's a first obligation to promote and to protect human rights and fundamental freedoms. Not to strip them away from us, but to promote them and protect them. It says, recognizing the right and responsibility. Again, there's that word, responsibility. A responsibility, a duty, it's calling for an obligation. Something that you can stand under, something that you can exercise. But recognizing the right, again, and responsibility of individuals to promote the respect for and foster knowledge of human rights and fundamental freedoms at national and international levels. So when you decide that you want to have respect for and defend and strive for human rights and fundamental freedoms, then it's actually a duty that you are performing. You are helping your fellow men and women by taking that role, taking that responsibility, and performing those duties. Article 3. Domestic law. Consistent with the Charter of the United Nations and other international obligations of the state in the field of human rights and fundamental freedoms is a juridical framework within which human rights and fundamental freedoms should be implemented and enjoyed, and within which all activities referred to in the present declaration for the promotion, protection, and effective realization of those rights and freedoms should be conducted. So Article 3 of the DRR states that domestic law, consistent with the charters of the UN and other international instruments on the promotion and the freedom and the respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms, are or is the juridical framework. It's the foundation. It's what it should be built upon. The domestic law should be built upon, or should follow, the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. And it should be implemented and enjoyed in domestic law. That's what Article 3 is teaching us. However, in domestic law, we find that instead of implementing the human rights and fundamental freedoms, they've stripped us of our fundamental rights and freedoms and classified us as legal persons with certain rights and freedoms who must pay for other rights and freedoms. And all of those rights and freedoms have nothing to do with our fundamental rights and freedoms as human beings. So all these domestic laws here in Canada, the enactments, the statutes, the regulations, we're supposed to find the fact that they are consistent, or that the framework in which they are built upon includes or expresses our fundamental human rights and freedoms. The liberties that have been granted to us, or the liberties that are recognized for men and women through the international instruments. Now, one of those international instruments is titled or called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And we see the expression of the obligation that Canada has to this international instrument. If you look in the Canadian Emergencies Act, you see what it says. And whereas the Governor and Council, in taking such special temporary measures, would be subject to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Bill of Rights, and must have regard to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, particularly with respect to those fundamental rights that are not to be limited or abridged even in a national emergency. So as you saw, in the Emergencies Act, which is a federal act of Canada, it states that Canada must respect the rights and freedoms that are declared in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, even in a time of emergency. They can't strip you of those fundamental rights and freedoms. Now, what about a time when we're not in emergency? Our rights and freedoms, then, that come through the International Covenants of Civil and Political Rights, the common law rights and freedoms that men have decided through the generations that we should be afforded and respected, it creates an obligation and a liability then upon Canada as a member party in emergency times or not in emergency times to respect the fundamental rights and freedoms that are recognized therein. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 16. Everyone shall have the right, no obligation, to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Freedoms, Article 6. Everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. In the International Covenant on Civil, Political Rights, you find that in Article 16, everyone has a right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. Now, this is an article of law that Canada, the state, is under obligation to follow and abide by. It creates a liability on Canada, and therefore it creates a liability on all those in de facto positions in Canada who are ruling in de facto authority. That everyone has a right, and that right that they have is they can enter into recognition as a juridical personality. But it does not say that everyone has an obligation and everyone must take recognition. Therefore, if everyone refuses or does not want to exercise that right that they've been given, it is their choice. That is an expression of the will of man. The human being, the man, has no obligation, but can, if they so choose, to take the designation or title person in law. If there was not an option, if there was not a choice, then we would definitely be held in ultimate slavery. However, there is an option. Everyone has the right. That is an option presented to mankind. You can take the designation, title, or recognition of juridical personality, but there is no obligation upon you. Now, there are those who want to say that you have no right, that we will force you to be recognized as a juridical personality. That is bondage. That is servitude. No one has the right to place anyone in servitude and hold them in servitude. That's the expression of the obligation and liability that Canada is under as a signatory to that covenant. That they have to permit you as an individual, standing alone as a man, a human being, or a woman, they have to permit you the right. Do you take recognition as a legal person, as a juridical personality, whether natural or not natural, artificial? Or do you stand with all your fundamental rights and freedoms as a man, a human being? That is a liability. And when you understand that, that is a liability on the state. It is one of the keys that you put into the locks in order to open up your freedom. Canada, the Financial Administration Act, Article 19.1. The Governor and Council may, on the recommendation of the Treasury Board, by regulation, prescribe the fees or charges to be paid for a right or privilege conferred by or on behalf of Her Majesty in the right of Canada by means of a license, permit, or other authorization by persons or classes of persons on whom the right or privilege is conferred, or b. authorize the appropriate minister to prescribe by order those fees or charges subject to such terms and conditions as may be specified by the Governor in Council. As you saw in the Financial Administration Act, Article 19.1, it talks about the fact that we are charged as persons for rights and privileges or benefits that we are granted by the de facto power. We are charged an amount of money, and then we are given a license or a permit or another authorization to exercise these benefits or these privileges. Now what's going on is the human being who has all his fundamental rights and freedoms and guarantees, as indicated in those covenants, is stripped of through a fundamental principle of justice, that's what they titled it, of all his rights and freedoms when he enters into recognition as a person. He's stripped of those human rights and freedoms. And now his rights and freedoms as a person is granted to him or conferred upon him through ministers that make the person pay for rights, benefits, and privileges through permit, a license, or other means. And that is on persons or classes of persons. So everyone, when he takes recognition as a person before the law, he then or she then has to pay for rights, benefits, and privileges in law. And this goes on with the fact of a person must pursue after a living, while a human being in the international instruments is supposed to be enjoying a living. Because as a human being standing with the fundamental rights and freedoms, the guarantees that are in these international covenants, food, clothing, housing, and the like, are yours to be expressed. And the state party, Canada, has an obligation to fulfill those for you personally when you begin to contact them, because there's a liability there. However, when they render you and strip you of your rights and freedoms through rendering you the person, then that liability, that guarantee is not anymore there. And you are now functioning from a deficient point of view, because now you are paying for rights and privileges and having to pursue after a living, instead of having them expressed for you. And that's the twisting that they've done here in the law against us as human beings. Now, the Declaration of Rights and Responsibilities of Individuals to Protect and Promote Human Rights and Freedoms. This is, when we see these things, this is disgusting what's going on here. When you understand, it's a form of slavery and bondage and servitude. The Criminal Code of Canada, Preamble, Definition Section, Municipality. Municipality includes, so it only means, the corporation of a city, town, village, county, township, parish, or other territorial or local division of a province. The inhabitants, so the ones who are living there, of which are incorporated or are entitled to hold property collectively for a public purpose. This is pretty important. If you catch it, you're going to see an operation that they're using against us here in Canada. Now, in the Criminal Code of Canada, It says a municipality is the corporation of a city, town, or village. So we all live in a municipality, according to the criminal code, and the municipality is a corporation. A corporation. Now, the inhabitants, the people who own property, the people who live in the municipality, the inhabitants are incorporated. You have been rendered legal persons, incorporated, and are entitled. Notice that word, entitled. They've given you a right, they've given you a privilege, an entitlement. Now remember, we pay for our rights and privileges as legal persons, but we are entitled to hold property. Notice that word does not say to own property, but to hold property collectively for a public purpose. So, in the municipality, a human being who is being forced or who has taken recognition as a legal person is considered incorporated with the municipality and is entitled, has an entitlement that it's paying for to the municipality to hold property collectively for a public purpose. Now, if you own a home in a municipality, you pay a tax bill. They send it to you. If you do not pay that tax bill, after 3 years, they will legally remove your person from its own property. Now, in that tax bill, they grant you garbage, they grant you water, they grant you sewer system, and it's an entitlement that you have. You are entitled to water in your house if you pay for it through your tax account. You are entitled to these things if you pay for it. And by doing so, your property is being held collectively with the city. And the rest of all the other properties around you are being held collectively with the city. And they are the city agents, the mayor, the ones who work in the city. Through paperwork, they are the ones who are considered administrators, or the ones who control who owns and what happens to your property. You, as the person, you go out and pursue after a living. You earn a living. Through earning a living, you turn around and you buy a property or a house to live in. And when you buy that property or house to live in, you're not given complete ownership rights. You're given certain ownership rights through your legal person. It's an entitlement that you pay for, again, that legal person. And this certain ownership rights is clearly expressed, because if you do not pay that tax account for your entitlements of water and the like, then in 3 years they will legally come and remove the person from whatever ownership rights it has upon the house. Now, a human being, a man and a woman, is not subject to any of this. But nevertheless, we see the operation of law, that when the human being, the man or woman, takes recognition as the legal person, what is happening to it? It is being stripped of fundamental rights and freedoms, such as the right to water. If you and I don't have water, we'll die. Shut off all the taps around the municipality tonight, because we all refuse to pay for this bill, for this right, because we understand that water is free and we shouldn't have to pay $160 million a day on interest on artificial money that's been created through keyboard strokes of a computer and not have the right to water. So we will not pay, and they will close all the taps, and we will die. Is that what will happen? I don't think so. But nevertheless, our water that we get to drink, that produces life in us and for us, is an entitlement that we must now pay for. And some will say when they see this video, well, you know, there's an infrastructure system. I agree, there is an infrastructure system. And paying $160 million a day for artificial money to international bankers, there's nothing to complain about. Criminal Code of Canada, definition section. Property includes real and personal property of every description, and deeds and instruments relating to or evidencing the title or right to property. Again, in the Criminal Code, it states that property is real and personal property, such as deeds and instruments, and these deeds and instruments are evidencing the title or right. Look at that word, right, for the property. Now that right is conferred or given to the person by paying for it and getting a permit or authorization. That's how you get the right. Criminal Code of Canada, definition section. Public stores. Public stores includes any personal property that is under the care, supervision, administration, or control of a public department, or of any person in the service of a public department. Criminal Code of Canada, definition section. Public stores. Public stores. Now I'm not talking about Maxi, and I'm not talking about Super C, but notice the terminology, the definition that they placed in the Criminal Code of Canada when it was written. They called this public stores. Includes, so it only means any personal property that is under care, supervision, administration, or control of a public department. Now to see if your personal property is actually under care, supervision, and administration, and control of a public department, if you own a house, go tomorrow and purchase a horse, and put him in your front lawn. Put a stake in the ground, tie the horse up there, and see if the administrators, the supervisors, the ones who have control of your personal property through the legal person, don't come and tell you, excuse me, sir or ma'am, there's a bylaw against this. You can't have a horse on your front lawn. Of course, we know rationally, don't put a horse on your front lawn. I'm just giving you an example. They would come and they would produce a bylaw against your person that says you can't do this action because we are administrators of your property, and we say it's detrimental for the rest of the public and for your property to have this on your property. Therefore, remove it with a threat of being fined or having to pay some money for not listening to us. That's the expression of it. But a public store is what they call them holding all our property, and it was what they call them administrating and taking care of and supervising our properties. To them it's considered a public store. And if one of us in this public store refuse or don't pay their tax bills, for example, and it has no reflection on me, I'm just using this because it touches most of us at home here. If one of us in the public stores refuse to pay that tax bill after 3 years, the administrators, the supervisors of this public store, the personal property that's incorporated into the municipality will come and will remove you, the person, the human being, the man, from its own home, and therefore strip you again of your fundamental rights and freedoms. Because as a human being, you have a right. You have a right. And Canada, the state party, has an obligation to make sure you have housing. Because if you don't have housing, it produces poverty. It produces sickness. It doesn't reflect well on our society. It doesn't reflect well for any of us. And why should any human being not have the right to have a place to lie his head at night when we pay, example, $160 million a day of interest to international bankers, and all that money is coming from the energy of the human beings here in Canada who are working to support this commercial system that makes absolutely no sense at all. But the human being, he has a fundamental right and freedom, and that is to his house. And his house, his home, is inviolable. That means no one can interfere with it. Not even Canada, not even the state party has the right to interfere with it when you stand as a human being. Regardless of the fact that as a person, when you take recognition as a person, they strip you of your title and your ownership rights, and they return to you a certain ownership rights to your own property that you pay for in the form of a tax account. Nevertheless, a human, that house is his, and that property is his. That's why in the Criminal Code of Canada, you find the expression in Article 37, everyone who is in peaceable possession of personal property under a claim of right, and anyone who comes after it with a legal documentation or a legal order has no right to that property if it's being held by that human being, by that man, under a claim of right.
Article 10. No one shall participate by act or by failure to act where required in violating human rights and fundamental freedoms, and no one shall be subjected to punishment or adverse action of any kind for refusing to do so.